A CEO collapsed at her own charity gala, designer dress pooling around her like spilled ink. The chandeliers blurred into stars as consciousness slipped away. When strong arms lifted her, not the manicured hands of her board members, but calloused fingers that knew real work, she found herself cradled against a chest that smelled of Kit Whitman smoke and determination. The single father who'd been serving champagne to millionaires was now carrying the most powerful woman in the city like she was made of glass. What happens when two worlds collide in the space between heartbeats? Some rescues change everything. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across Victoria Whitman's face as she adjusted the microphone for the third time. Her fingers, steady enough to sign million-dollar deals, trembled against the polished metal. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel stretched before her like an ocean of expectant faces, investors, philanthropists, journalists, all waiting for her words about the children's hospital wing that would bear her company's name. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority that had built Meridian Tech from a garage startup to a Fortune 500 company. "Tonight we gather not just as business leaders, but as..." The words dissolved. The room tilted sideways. Victoria's last conscious thought was of her mother's voice years ago. "You carry too much, little bird. One day, those wings will break." Jake Rivera caught the champagne flute before it hit the marble floor. His hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 15 years in food service, 10 of those while raising a daughter alone. The crystal sang as he set it safely on his serving tray, then looked up to see the most powerful woman in Seattle, crumpling like paper. Time stretched. The crowd gasped as one organism, but Jake was already moving, his server's jacket forgotten as he pushed through the paralyzed cluster of board members and socialites. He'd carried his unconscious daughter to the emergency room twice, once for appendicitis, once after she'd fainted during a growth spurt. His body knew what to do before his mind caught up. Victoria Whitman weighed almost nothing in his arms. Designer fabric whispered against his white shirt as he lifted her, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. Her head fell against his shoulder, dark hair escaping its perfect chignon. "Someone call 911, he said, loud enough to cut through the murmur of panic, "and clear a path to the Kit Whitman. There's more room back there." The crowd parted. Jake walked steadily, not rushing, keeping his breathing even. Behind him, he heard the rustle of expensive gowns and the sharp click of heels on marble as people followed, but his focus narrowed to the woman in his arms and the steady rhythm of his steps. The Kit Whitman doors swung open to reveal Jake's world's stainless steel surfaces, the controlled chaos of a catering operation mid-service, the sharp scents of herbs and hot oil. Chef Romano looked up from plating desserts, his thick eyebrows rising. "Maria Santissima," Romano breathed, crossing himself. "What happened?" "She collapsed during her speech," Jake said, moving toward the prep area where they'd set up a makeshift break room. "Help me clear this table." Romano swept aside order sheets and utensil containers with one practiced motion. Jake lowered Victoria onto the surface, supporting her head as she settled. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her face pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheekbones. The Kit Whitman doors burst open again. A cluster of suits flooded in Victoria's assistant, a man Jake recognized as the CFO, and a woman with silver hair who commanded attention like gravity. Victoria's stepmother, Eleanor Whitman, though she'd kept her first husband's name when she married Victoria's father. "What happened?" Eleanor's voice could have cut glass. "Where are the paramedics?" "On their way," Jake said, not moving from Victoria's side. He'd positioned himself between her and the growing crowd, a unconscious protective stance. "She needs space to breathe." Eleanor's eyes fixed on him for the first time, taking in his server's vest, his calloused hand still steady near Victoria's shoulder. "And you are?" "Jake Rivera. I work for the catering company." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "You're the one who caught her." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded anyway. The paramedics arrived in a rush of professional calm, equipment bags and authoritative voices. Jake stepped back, but not far. He watched as they checked Victoria's vitals, asking questions no one could answer. When had she last eaten? How much had she slept? Was she taking any medications? The answers painted a picture Jake recognized from his own mirror on bad days. Too little food, too little rest, too much pressure carried alone. Blood pressure's low, one paramedic said to his partner. Could be exhaustion, dehydration, or something else. We need to transport. Victoria stirred as they prepared the stretcher. Her eyelids fluttered, and Jake found himself stepping forward again, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the medical chatter. "Take it easy. You're safe." Victoria's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding his face. He saw the moment awareness returned, the slight widening of her eyes, the quick assessment of her surroundings. She tried to sit up, and Jake gently pressed her shoulder back down. "Don't," he said. "Let them do their job." "I need to." Victoria's voice was hoarse. "The gala is being handled," Eleanor interrupted, appearing at Victoria's other side. "The foundation board is managing the guests. You need to go to the hospital." Victoria's gaze moved between Eleanor and Jake, lingering on his face with an expression he couldn't read. "You're the waiter," she said. "Not an accusation, just recognition." "Jake," he said, "and you scared the hell out of everyone." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Wasn't intentional." The paramedics lifted the stretcher, and the moment broke. Victoria disappeared behind a wall of medical efficiency and family concern, leaving Jake standing in the Kit Whitman doorway as the doors swung shut behind them. Romano appeared at his elbow, holding a clean towel. "Your shirt," he said. Jake looked down to see a smudge of makeup on his collar, a strand of dark hair clinging to his sleeve. Evidence of the moment when Seattle's most powerful CEO had been as vulnerable as anyone else. "The guests?" Jake asked. "Going home," Romano said. "Event's over, but we still got to clean up." Jake nodded, tucking the strand of hair into his pocket without thinking about why. The Kit Whitman returned to its usual controlled chaos, staff boxing leftover canapes, washing crystal glasses, breaking down serving stations. But something had shifted, like the moment after lightning when the air still holds electric charge. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter Sophia. "How's the fancy party, Dad? Meeting any rich people?" Jake stared at the message, thinking of Victoria's weight in his arms, the way her hand had briefly gripped his shirt as consciousness returned. He typed back, something like that. "Home soon." The cleanup took 2 hours. Jake worked methodically, his hands busy with familiar tasks, while his mind turned over the evening's events. He'd served dozens of corporate events, moved through hundreds of rooms where power and money gathered like well-dressed storms. But he'd never been at the center of one of those storms, never felt the sudden intimacy that comes from holding someone at their most vulnerable moment. As he loaded the last of the serving trays into Romano's van, Chef clapped him on the shoulder. "Good thing you move fast," Romano said. "Could have been bad if she hit that marble." Jake nodded, but something about Romano's tone made him look closer at the older man's expression. "What?" "Nothing," Romano said, but his eyes held the weight of long experience in the service industry. "Just people like her. They don't usually notice people like us, until they need us." The observation sat heavy in Jake's chest as he drove home through Seattle's late-night streets. The city looked different from behind his steering wheel than it had from the Meridian's marble floors, smaller, more manageable, more real. His apartment building stood like a fortress of middle-class stability, all brick and practical windows, nothing like the glass towers where Victoria Whitman lived her life. Sophia was asleep when he got home, but she'd left her math homework spread across the Kit Whitman table, a silent signal that she'd struggled with the algebra again and hoped he'd check her work before school. Jake smiled. hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. This was his world: homework, help, and grocery lists, and the quiet satisfaction of being needed in ways that mattered. But as he reviewed Sophia's equations, he found his mind drifting to the weight of Victoria Whitman in his arms, the moment when her eyes had focused on his face with something that looked like recognition. Not just seeing him, but seeing him. His phone buzzed again. An unknown number, a text message. "This is Eleanor Whitman. I'd like to speak with you tomorrow about tonight. Are you available?" Jake stared at the screen, his daughter's algebra problems forgotten. Outside, Seattle hummed with its usual nighttime energy, but inside his Kit Whitman, the silence stretched taut with possibility and questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He typed back, "What time?" The response came quickly. "Noon. Meridian Tech Building, 45th floor. Ask for Mrs. Whitman." Jake set the phone down and looked around his Kit Whitman at Sophia's homework, at the bills stacked neatly on the counter, at the photo on the refrigerator of him and his daughter at her middle school graduation. His life, contained and comprehensible. Tomorrow he would enter Victoria Whitman's world for the second time, but tonight he belonged here, in the space between paycheck and responsibility, where love was measured in homework help and morning coffee, and where caring someone meant something different than it did in ballrooms full of crystal light. He finished checking Sophia's algebra, made corrections in red pen, and left the papers where she'd find them in the morning. Then he sat at the Kit Whitman table, pulling the strand of dark hair from his pocket and holding it up to the light. Some rescues, he thought, change everything. He wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. The Meridian Tech Building pierced the Seattle sky like a steel and glass needle, its 47 floors reflecting clouds that moved too fast for comfort. Jake stood on the sidewalk, craning his neck to find the top, feeling suddenly small in his one good suit, the same navy blue he'd worn to job interviews and Sophia's school conferences. Noon traffic hummed around him, but the sound felt muffled, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He'd dropped Sophia at school that morning without mentioning where he was going. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? "Mrs. Whitman wants to see me." The words had echoed in his head through his morning shift at Romano's Prep Kit Whitman, through the mundane tasks of chopping vegetables and checking inventory. Normal life, interrupted by something that felt like the beginning of a story he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of. The lobby swallowed him whole. Marble floors stretched toward a ceiling that disappeared into geometric shadows, and the air tasted of expensive cologne and ambition. A security desk stood like an altar, staffed by guards whose eyes assessed him with professional neutrality. "Jake Rivera," he said to the woman behind the desk. "I have an appointment with Mrs. Whitman." She typed something into her computer, studying the screen with the concentration of someone reading classified documents. 45th floor. Elevator Bank C. The elevator rose smoothly, numbers climbing past floors that contained more money than Jake had seen in his lifetime. Through the glass walls, Seattle spread below him like a map of possibilities, the sound stretching toward mountains, neighborhoods laid out in neat grids, his own apartment building somewhere in the distance, too small to see. The 45th floor opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that power wore expensive clothes. Deep carpets, leather furniture, the color of good whiskey, and windows that turned the city into art. "Mr. Rivera?" A woman approached, mid-30s, efficient smile, tablet clutched against her chest like armor. "I'm Sarah, Mrs. Whitman's assistant. She's waiting for you in the conference room." They walked down a hallway lined with photographs. Victoria Whitman through the years, accepting awards, shaking hands with politicians, standing before buildings that wore her company's logo like crowns. In every photo, she looked untouchable, perfect, nothing like the woman who had collapsed in his arms 12 hours ago. The conference room could have held Jake's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced west toward the sound, and a table that could seat 20, dominated the space. Eleanor Whitman sat at the far end, a coffee service arranged before her like a business meeting disguised as hospitality. She looked older in daylight, Jake thought, but no less formidable. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that probably cost more than his rent, and her suit was the kind of black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "Mr. Rivera," she said, rising to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, brief, measuring. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Jake chose a chair across from her, conscious of the way the leather whispered beneath him. Eleanor poured coffee from a silver service, her movements precise and practiced. "How do you take it?" she asked. "Black." She smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "A practical man. I appreciate that." The coffee was better than anything Jake had ever tasted, rich and complex in ways that reminded him there were levels of quality he'd never experienced. Eleanor watched him drink, her own cup untouched. "Victoria is fine," she said without preamble. "Dehydration and exhaustion, as the doctors suspected. They've released her, but under strict orders to rest." She paused, studying his face. "I wanted to thank you personally for your quick thinking last night." Jake set down his cup. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "They wouldn't have. There were 60 people in that room when Victoria collapsed. You were the only one who moved." The words sat between them like a challenge. Jake thought of the frozen faces in the crowd, the way wealth and power had turned to paralysis in the face of human vulnerability. "You have a daughter," Eleanor continued. It wasn't a question. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Sophia. She's 13. And you've raised her alone since she was 3. The cold spread. Jake leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how much space Eleanor Whitman commanded simply by existing. "You've been looking into me." "Of course I have." Eleanor's tone suggested this was as natural as breathing. Jake Rivera, 38 years old. Former Army medic, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Honorable discharge following an IED explosion that left you with a permanent injury to your left leg, barely noticeable now, but enough to end your military career. You moved to Seattle 7 years ago, worked your way up from dishwasher to catering manager. Perfect employment record, no debt beyond normal expenses, daughter on the honor roll at Roosevelt Middle School. Jake felt exposed, as if Eleanor had somehow seen him naked. "Why?" Eleanor picked up her coffee, took a small sip, set it down with the care of someone performing a ritual. "Because my stepdaughter is one of the most important people in this city, and last night a stranger held her life in his hands. I needed to know who that stranger was. I'm not a threat to your family." "I know." Eleanor's voice carried absolute certainty. "That's why you're here." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken implications. Through the windows, Seattle went about its business, traffic and construction, and the ordinary machinery of commerce. Jake thought of Sophia, probably in English class right now, writing essays about books she'd devoured in a single night. His world continuing without him. "Victoria wants to see you," Eleanor said finally. Jake's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. "Why?" "I was hoping you could tell me." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of something beneath her composed exterior: concern, maybe, or fear. "She's been asking about you since she woke up this morning. The waiter who caught her, she keeps saying. As if it matters." "Maybe it does matter." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "To her or to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake thought of the strand of dark hair in his jacket pocket, of the moment when Victoria's eyes had found his face and held it with something that looked like recognition. "I don't know," he said honestly. Eleanor nodded, as if this was the answer she'd been waiting for. "She's at home today. Magnolia, overlooking the Sound. I can give you the address. She wants to see me? She asked me to ask you." Eleanor reached into her purse, withdrew a card, slid it across the polished table. "But I need you to understand something, Mr. Rivera. Victoria is complicated. She's been carrying responsibility since she was younger than your daughter. The company, the family legacy, the weight of other people's expectations. It's made her strong, but it's also made her isolated. Jake picked up the card. The address meant nothing to him, but he could imagine the kind of house that came with a Magnolia zip code, something with views and gardens and rooms that existed only for beauty. "What are you asking me?" he said. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out the windows toward the sound. When she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that money couldn't buy. Last night, for just a moment, someone saw Victoria as a person instead of a position. I'm asking you to remember that she's human, whatever else she might be. The house sat on a bluff overlooking Elliott Bay like a piece of architectural poetry. All clean lines and glass, it seemed to float between sky and water, anchored to the earth by gravity alone. Jake parked his 15-year-old Honda beside a garage that probably cost more than his annual salary, feeling like an imposter in his own life. The front door opened before he could knock. Victoria Whitman stood in the doorway, and Jake felt his breath catch. She looked nothing like the polished executive from the newspaper photos or the unconscious woman from last night. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, she wore jeans and a sweater the color of sea glass, and her feet were bare. She looked human. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice, relief, maybe, or surprise. "You asked me to." Victoria stepped back, letting him into a foyer that managed to be both grand and intimate. Light poured through windows that faced the water, and the air smelled of coffee and something floral. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked. "Like I've been hit by a truck." Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face completely. "But alive. Thanks to you." They stood in her hallway, two strangers connected by a moment of crisis, neither quite sure how to proceed. Jake looked around, taking in the details: family photos on a side table, a pair of running shoes kicked carelessly beside the door, a coffee mug abandoned on the windowsill. Signs of a life lived despite the perfection of the setting. "Can I offer you something? Coffee? Water?" Victoria's hands moved restlessly, betraying nervousness that her voice didn't reveal. "Coffee sounds good." She led him toward the back of the house, through rooms that flowed into each other like movements in a symphony. The kit Whitman was beautiful and functional, all marble countertops and professional appliances, but it was the view that stopped Jake cold. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Puget Sound stretched toward the Olympic Mountains, water and sky blending into infinity. A ferry moved across the water like a distant dream, and somewhere in the blue distance lay the rest of the world. "Jesus," Jake breathed. Victoria followed his gaze, and her expression softened. "I never get tired of it. Some mornings I stand here for an hour, just watching the water change color." She moved around the kit Whitman with easy efficiency, grinding beans, measuring coffee, her movements unconsciously graceful. Jake watched her hands, long-fingered, unadorned except for a simple watch, calloused at the fingertips in a way that suggested she played guitar or violin. "Violin," Victoria said, noticing his attention. "Since I was 6. Eleanor's idea, she thought it would teach me discipline." "Did it?" Victoria's laugh was rueful. "Too much, maybe." The coffee maker hummed to life, filling the silence. Victoria leaned against the counter, studying Jake with the same intensity he'd felt from Eleanor, but warmer, more curious than calculating. "You were a medic," she said. Jake nodded, unsurprised that she knew. "Army, 2 tours. Is that why you moved so fast last night? Training?" Jake considered the question, remembering the weight of her in his arms, the way his body had responded before his mind caught up. "Partly, but mostly because I'm a father." Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a recognition maybe, or understanding. "Sophia. You know about her too. Eleanor's very thorough." Victoria's voice carried a note of apology. "I asked her to find out who you were. I needed to know who." She trailed off, looking out at the water. "Who what?" Victoria turned back to him, and Jake saw vulnerability in her eyes that reminded him of the moment she'd regained consciousness in the Kit Whitman. "Who held me when I fell?" she said quietly. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. The coffee maker finished its cycle with a gentle beep, but neither of them moved. "Why did you want to see me?" Jake asked. Victoria poured 2 cups, her movements deliberate and careful. She handed him one, their fingers brushing in the exchange a moment of contact that felt electric. "Because I can't remember the last time someone caught me," she said. They moved to the living room, a space that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Jake sank into a chair that probably cost more than his car. Victoria curled onto the sofa across from him, her legs tucked beneath her. "Tell me about Sophia," Victoria said. The request surprised him. "Why?" "Because when you talk about her, your whole face changes. And because I've never seen that before, the way someone lights up talking about their child." Jake set down his coffee cup, studying Victoria's face for signs of pity or condescension. He found only genuine curiosity. "She's brilliant," he said finally. "Smarter than I'll ever be. She reads 3 books a week, writes stories about dragons and spaceships, asks questions that keep me awake at night, trying to figure out the answers." "What kind of questions?" "Last week she asked me if it's possible to be homesick for a place you've never been." Jake smiled at the memory. "Spent 2 hours trying to explain that one." Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. "What did you tell her?" "That maybe homesickness isn't about places. Maybe it's about versions of ourselves we've never been allowed to be." Silence settled between them, but it was comfortable now, charged with understanding rather than awkwardness. Through the windows, the afternoon light shifted, turning the sound into molten silver. "I don't have children," Victoria said quietly. "Never seemed to fit into the timeline. College, then building the company, then keeping it alive through 3 recessions and a pandemic. By the time I looked around, I was 38, and everyone kept telling me my biological clock was ticking, as if I was a bomb about to go off." Jake heard the loneliness beneath her words, the weight of choices made and unmade. "Do you regret it?" Victoria was quiet for a long time, looking out at the water. "I regret not having the luxury of wondering what else I might have been." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Jake thought of his own timeline: marriage at 21, fatherhood at 25, widowhood at 28, when Jessica's cancer took her as suddenly as a summer storm, the way life had shaped him into someone he'd never planned to become. "I should go," he said, though he didn't move. "Should you?" Victoria's voice was soft, questioning. Jake looked at her, really looked. The afternoon light caught in her hair, cast shadows that softened the sharp lines of her face. She looked younger here, in her own space, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. "I don't know what this is," he said honestly. "Neither do I." Victoria smiled, and it was different from any expression he'd seen from her before: tentative, hopeful, real. "But maybe that's okay." Jake stood, and Victoria rose with him. They walked to the front door together, the silence between them full of unspoken possibilities. At the threshold, Victoria caught his arm. "Jake?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you. For last night, and for today. For seeing me." He turned to face her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, to smell the subtle perfume that seemed to be part of her skin. "You're easy to see," he said. Victoria's breath caught. For a moment, Jake thought she might step closer, thought he might reach for her. The air between them hummed with possibility. Instead, she stepped back, her composure sliding back into place like armor. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Jake thought of his daughter waiting at home, of homework and dinner and the comfortable routines that made up his real life. Then he thought of Victoria standing in her perfect Kit Whitman, admitting to loneliness as vast as the view from her windows. "Yes," he said, though he wasn't sure how. The word felt like a promise, or maybe a confession. Sophia was sketching at the Kit Whitman table when Jake got home, her math homework pushed aside in favor of a drawing that looked like a city made of clouds. She glanced up as he hung his jacket on the back of his chair, her dark eyes so much like her mother's taking in details he hoped weren't visible. "You're wearing your good shirt," she said without looking up from her drawing. "And you smell different." Jake paused, one hand still on his jacket. "Different how?" "Expensive." Sophia's pencil moved across the paper in quick, confident strokes. "Like those stores in the mall where they spray perfume at you when you walk by." At 13, his daughter noticed everything and forgot nothing. It was a trait that served her well in school but made keeping secrets from her nearly impossible. "I had a meeting," Jake said, which was true without being complete. "About work?" "Sort of." Sophia set down her pencil and fixed him with the look she'd inherited from her mother, patient but implacable, the expression of someone who would wait all day for a real answer. Jake pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Someone I met last night wants to see me again. Someone like a someone, or someone like a job interview someone." The question was casual, but Jake caught the careful note in her voice. Sophia had been asking about dating for the past year, wondering aloud why he never brought anyone home, why he spent Friday nights helping her with homework instead of going out. She claimed not to care, but Jake had noticed the way she watched other families at school, events, mothers and fathers standing together, the easy intimacy of couples who shared the weight of parenting. "Someone like a person I'm trying to figure out," he said finally. Sophia nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Is she nice?" "How do you know it's a she?" "Because you're being weird about it, and you only get weird about girls." Sophia picked up her pencil again, adding details to what Jake now realized was meant to be Seattle's skyline. "Also, you keep touching your jacket pocket like you're checking for something." Jake's hand stilled. He'd been unconsciously reaching for the strand of Victoria's hair, carrying it like a talisman. "She's complicated." "Good complicated or bad complicated?" Jake thought of Victoria standing in her perfect Kit Whitman, admitting to loneliness as vast as the sound. Of the way she'd looked at him when he'd said she was easy to see, surprise and gratitude, and something deeper. "I don't know yet." Sophia added a few more lines to her drawing, then pushed it across the table. "What do you think?" Jake studied the sketch. She'd drawn the city as he'd never seen it, buildings that curved like waves, bridges made of light, the whole thing floating above clouds that looked solid enough to walk on. "It's beautiful," he said. "What is it?" "The city I want to live in when I'm older." Sophia's voice carried the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who believed the future was a place she could design. "Where buildings are art, and everyone has a view of something beautiful." Jake looked at his daughter, really looked. When had her face started to show the woman she was becoming? When had her drawings stopped being simple pictures and started being visions? "Why clouds?" he asked. Sophia shrugged, but Jake caught the shy smile that meant she was about to share something important. "Because clouds change shape, but they're still the same cloud. Like people, maybe. We can look different from the outside, but we're still us underneath." The observation hit Jake with unexpected force. He thought of Victoria in her boardroom versus Victoria in bare feet, of the way power could be both armor and prison. "That's very wise," he said. "I get it from my dad." Sophia grinned, and Jake felt his heart squeeze with the particular ache of loving someone who was growing up faster than he was ready for. His phone buzzed against the table. A text from an unknown number. "Thank you for today. I hope I'll see you soon." Sophia's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to his face. "Is that her?" Jake nodded, not sure why he wasn't trying to hide it. "You should text her back," Sophia said. "It's rude to leave people hanging." Jake typed, "Me too." The response came quickly. "Are you free for dinner tomorrow? Somewhere normal." "My choice." Jake stared at the screen, aware of Sophia watching him with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "She wants to have dinner," he said. "That's good." "You need to eat more vegetables." "Despite everything," Jake laughed. I don't think she's asking because she's worried about my nutrition. Then, why is she asking? It was a 13-year-old's question, direct and uncompromised by adult complications. Jake considered possible answers: attraction, curiosity, gratitude, loneliness. All true, none complete. Because sometimes people connect in unexpected ways, he said finally. Sophia nodded gravely. Like how I'm friends with Katie even though she's popular and I'm weird. You're not weird, Soph. You're extraordinary. Same thing, most of the time. Sophia gathered her drawing supplies, preparing to move to her room for the evening's homework marathon. At the doorway, she paused. Dad? Yeah? If you like her, you should tell her. Life's too short to pretend we don't feel things. Jake stared at his daughter, wondering when she'd become wise enough to dispense advice about matters of the heart. Where did you learn that? From watching you miss Mom, Sophia said quietly, and from watching you think you're not allowed to stop missing her. The words hit like a physical blow. Jake felt his throat close, his eyes burn with tears he'd been holding back for 10 years. Soph, it's okay, Dad, I miss her too, but she's not coming back. And you're still here, and maybe it's time to let yourself be happy again. She disappeared into her room before Jake could respond, leaving him alone at the Kit Whitman table with her drawing and the weight of her too adult wisdom. He typed back to Victoria, Yes. Where? Ivar's on the waterfront, 7 p.m. Is that normal enough? Jake smiled despite the tightness in his chest. Ivar's a Seattle institution, famous for fish and chips and tourists, as far from her usual world as she could probably imagine. Perfect. Ivar's at 7 o'clock was everything Jake had expected: crowded, loud, smelling of fried fish and salt air. He found Victoria at a corner table, and for a moment he didn't recognize her. She wore jeans and a Seahawks sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup except for mascara that made her eyes look enormous. She looked like someone he might have met in any normal circumstances, and somehow that made everything more complicated. You look surprised, Victoria said as he sat down across from her. You look like a different person. Is that good or bad? Jake studied her face, the way the fluorescent lighting caught the laugh lines around her eyes, the small scar on her chin that makeup usually covered. More real? He said. Victoria's smile was self-conscious. I wasn't sure how to dress for this. I don't actually go to places like this very often. Why here then? Because I wanted to see who I am when I'm not being Victoria Whitman, CEO. She gestured around the restaurant: families with small children, teenagers on dates, old couples sharing fish and chips. I wanted to see who I am when I'm just Victoria. A server approached a kid who couldn't be much older than Sophia, all nervous energy and practiced enthusiasm. Victoria ordered fish and chips. Jake did the same, and they were left alone in the comfortable chaos of a busy restaurant. Tell me about your day, Victoria said. It was such a normal request that Jake felt momentarily disoriented. My day? I realized I don't know anything about your actual life. What do you do when you're not catching fainting CEOs? Jake found himself talking about his morning at Romano's Kit Whitman, about inventory and prep work and the quiet satisfaction of perfectly diced vegetables, about picking up Sophia from school and helping her with algebra, about her drawings and her questions and the way she saw the world as something that could be reimagined. Victoria listened with an attention that felt like a physical presence, asking questions that showed she was actually hearing him. When had someone last listened to him like this? When had his ordinary life felt worth explaining to another person? She sounds remarkable, Victoria said when he finished. Your daughter. She is. Sometimes I think she's raising me as much as I'm raising her. Victoria's expression grew wistful. What's that like? Having someone who sees you that clearly? Terrifying, Jake said honestly. And wonderful. She calls me on all my bullshit, but she also believes I can do anything. It's like having a mirror that shows you both who you are and who you could be. The food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence, watching tourists take selfies at the window tables. The fish was perfectly fried, the kind of simple, honest food that tasted like what it was supposed to be. "My turn," Jake said. "Tell me about your day." Victoria set down her fork, considering the question. "I spent 3 hours in meetings about quarterly projections, an hour reviewing contracts for the new Portland office, and 30 minutes on a conference call with investors in Tokyo." She paused, looking out at the water. "And I thought about you for most of it." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Jake felt his pulse quicken. "What did you think?" Victoria turned back to him, and Jake saw something in her expression that reminded him of Sophia when she was working up courage to share something important. "I thought about how it felt to be caught," she said, "not just physically, but seen. Really seen by someone who didn't want anything from me except to make sure I was okay." Jake reached across the table without thinking, covering her hand with his. Her fingers were cool, slender, trembling slightly beneath his palm. "Victoria, I know this is crazy," she said quickly. "I know we're from completely different worlds, that this probably can't work, that I'm asking too much." "You're not asking anything. I'm asking for a chance." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm asking you to let me figure out who I am when I'm with someone who sees me as a person first." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, like a door he'd kept locked for 10 years finally opening. He thought of Sophia's words, "Maybe it's time to let yourself be happy again." "What would that look like?" he asked. Victoria's smile was tentative but real. "I don't know. I've never done this before, dated someone. I mean, someone who wasn't chosen for me by circumstance or convenience or business advantage." "You've never dated?" "Not like this. Not someone I chose because I wanted to know them better." Victoria's cheeks flushed pink. "Not someone who makes me nervous." Jake felt something warm spread through his chest. "I make you nervous?" "Terrified," Victoria said. "You make me feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and I've never been afraid of heights before." The metaphor hung between them, charged with possibility. Jake thought of all the ways this could go wrong, the differences in their worlds, the complications of his responsibilities as a father, the simple impossibility of bridging the gap between their lives. Then he thought of Victoria standing in her Kit Whitman that afternoon, bare feet and honest eyes, asking him to see her. "I'm scared too," he said. Victoria's fingers turned beneath his palm, threading through his fingers. Her grip was firm, anchoring. "What are you scared of?" Jake looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. "Of not being enough. Of you realizing that underneath everything, I'm just a guy who serves food and raises his daughter and tries to fix things when they break." "Jake." Victoria's voice was soft but certain. "That's exactly why I'm not scared of you. You're real. You're solid. You're someone who catches people when they fall." The words settled around them like a benediction. Outside the restaurant windows, Seattle's lights were beginning to flicker on, the city transforming itself from day to night. Ferry horns sounded across the water, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played guitar. "So, what happens now?" Jake asked. Victoria smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen all day. "Now we figure it out as we go. No timelines, no expectations, just seeing what happens when two people let themselves be curious about each other." Jake squeezed her hand. "I can do curious." "Good," Victoria said. "Because I have about 1,000,000 questions, starting with what your daughter's favorite book is and ending with whether you've ever thought about what your own city of clouds would look like." Jake laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Those are good questions. I'm full of them. Fair warning." They finished dinner as the sun set over Elliott Bay, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. When they walked out of the restaurant together, Victoria slipped her hand into his, as naturally as breathing, and Jake felt something he'd forgotten how to feel. The simple pleasure of being chosen by someone who saw him clearly and wanted him anyway. "Can I drive you home?" he asked as they reached the street. Victoria looked at his Honda, then back at his face. "Actually, would you mind walking with me for a while? I don't get to walk through the city very often. Usually, I'm always rushing from one place to another." They strolled along the waterfront, past street vendors and late-night joggers, talking about everything and nothing. Victoria asked about his time in the army, about how he'd learned to cook, about what he hoped for Sophia's future. Jake found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone about Jessica and their too-brief marriage, about the challenges of single parenthood, about the small victories that made up most of life. When they finally reached Victoria's car, a modest sedan that surprised Jake with its normalcy, she turned to face him. "I had a really good time tonight," she said. "Me too." Victoria stepped closer, close enough that Jake could smell her shampoo, see the way the streetlight caught the gold flecks in her eyes. "Can I see you again?" she asked. "Yes," Jake said, and the word felt like a promise he was finally ready to make. Victoria rose up on her toes and kissed his cheek, a soft press of lips that sent warmth spiraling through his chest. "Good," she whispered against his ear, "because I think I'm going to want to know everything about you." She got in her car and drove away, leaving Jake standing on the sidewalk with the taste of possibility on his lips and the knowledge that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. When he got home, Sophia was waiting at the Kit Whitman table, homework spread around her like evidence of a productive evening. "How was dinner?" she asked without looking up from her chemistry notes. "Good," Jake said, hanging up his jacket. "Really good." Sophia glanced up, studied his face, and smiled. "You look happy, Dad." "I think I am," Jake said, and realized it was true. "Good," Sophia said, returning to her homework. "It's about time." Jake stood in his Kit Whitman, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his ordinary life, and felt the future stretching out before him like an unwritten story. For the first time in 10 years, he couldn't wait to see what happened next. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the produce section of Pike Place Market, Victoria's hand warm in his as she studied tomatoes with the intensity of someone making a life-altering decision. Saturday morning shoppers flowed around them like water, and the air buzzed with the controlled chaos of the market vendors calling out prices. Street musicians competing for attention, the salt-sweet smell of the sound mixing with coffee and fresh bread. "These ones," Victoria said finally, selecting 3 tomatoes with the careful consideration she probably applied to million-dollar acquisitions. "They smell like summer." Jake watched her add them to the basket he carried, marveling at how 3 weeks had transformed this shopping for groceries together, her fingers sticky with peach juice from samples, her laugh bright and unguarded when a flower vendor insisted she take a free daffodil for her hair. They'd been careful these past weeks. Dinner at quiet restaurants, walks along the waterfront, a museum visit where Victoria had stood before a Rothko painting and cried without explanation. Getting to know each other in increments, building something that felt both fragile and inevitable. Today was different. Today, Victoria was coming to his apartment for lunch. Today, she would meet Sophia. "You're nervous," Victoria observed as they waited in line at the fish counter. "Terrified," Jake admitted. Victoria squeezed his hand. "She's going to love you." "She already loves me. That's not what I'm worried about." "What then?" Jake watched the fishmonger wrap salmon in white paper, the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done the same task thousands of times. "What if she doesn't understand why you matter to me? What if I can't explain it in a way that makes sense to a 13-year-old? Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying his profile. "What would you want to explain?" The question caught him off guard. Jake thought of all the ways he could answer about loneliness and connection, about the way Victoria's presence had brought color back to parts of his life he'd forgotten existed, about how she listened to his stories as if they mattered, how she asked Sophia questions in her texts to him, how she'd started leaving her expensive clothes at home when they went out, as if she was shedding layers of armor, one piece at a time. "That you make me remember who I used to be," he said finally. Before I became just Sophia's dad and Jake the caterer, you make me feel like I'm allowed to want things for myself again." Victoria stopped walking. Right there in the middle of Pike Place Market, with tourists and locals flowing around them, she stopped and turned to face him fully. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you don't have to explain that to her. She already knows." "How?" "Because she's the one who told you to text me back that first day. She's the one who's been asking about me, encouraging you to see me. She wants you to be happy." The truth of it hit Jake like a wave. Sophia had been his strongest advocate for this relationship, the one pushing him towards something she could see he needed before he could see it himself. "She's smarter than both of us," he said. "Most teenagers are. It's terrifying." They finished shopping and drove to Jake's apartment, Victoria quiet in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming against her knee in a rhythm that betrayed nerves she was trying to hide. Jake parked in his usual spot and looked up at the brick building that had been home for 7 years, solid, unpretentious, nothing like the glass towers where Victoria spent her days. "It's not much," he said. Victoria followed his gaze to the building, taking in the small garden maintained by tenants, the children's bikes chained to the front porch, the basketball hoop someone had installed over the parking area. "It looks like a place where people live real lives," she said. "I like it." They climbed 2 flights of stairs, Jake's keys jingling as he unlocked 2B. The apartment welcomed them with familiar smells, coffee, and the lavender soap Sophia preferred, the lingering scent of last night's dinner. Home, in all its imperfect comfort. "Dad?" Sophia's voice came from the living room. "Is that you?" "Yeah, and I brought someone I'd like you to meet." Sophia appeared in the Kit Whitman doorway, and Jake felt his breath catch. She dressed up not formally, but carefully. Her best jeans, the sweater Jessica's mother had sent for her birthday, her hair brushed until it shone. She looked nervous and excited and impossibly grown-up. "You must be Sophia," Victoria said, stepping forward with a smile that seemed genuinely delighted. "I'm Victoria. I've heard so much about you." "Good things, I hope," Sophia said, shaking Victoria's offered hand with the careful politeness Jake had taught her. "The best things. Your dad is very proud of you." Sophia glanced at Jake, then back at Victoria, her assessment obvious and thorough. Jake held his breath, waiting for judgment from the person whose opinion mattered most. "Do you want to see my room?" Sophia asked suddenly. "I have some drawings I've been working on." Victoria's face lit up. "I'd love that." Jake watched them disappear down the hallway, Victoria asking questions about the photos lining the walls, Sophia's responses growing more animated with each step. From the Kit Whitman, he could hear the murmur of their voices, punctuated by laughter that made his chest warm. He busied himself with lunch preparation, grateful for the familiar rhythms of cooking. Salmon seasoned simply, vegetables roasted until they caramelized, bread from the bakery Sophia loved. Food as comfort, as welcome, as love made tangible. "Dad, you have to see this," Sophia called from her room. Jake dried his hands and followed the sound of their voices. He found them sitting on Sophia's bed, a sketchbook open between them, Victoria pointing at something on the page while Sophia explained her artistic choices. "She's designing a library," Victoria said, as Jake appeared in the doorway. "But not just any library, one where the books change based on what the reader needs to know. The idea is that the library reads you while you're reading," Sophia added, her face flushed with enthusiasm. "So if you're sad, it shows you books that will help. If you're curious about something, the right book appears right when you need it." Jake looked at his daughter's drawing detailed architectural plans mixed with whimsical elements, a building that seemed to breathe with organic life while maintaining structural integrity. When had her imagination grown so sophisticated? "It's brilliant," Victoria said, and Jake could hear genuine admiration in her voice. "You know, we're designing a new public library in Tacoma. Would you be interested in sharing some of your ideas with our architects?" Sophia's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd want my ideas?" "I'd value them. Fresh perspective is the most important thing in any design process. Jake watched the exchange, seeing something pass between Victoria and his daughter, a recognition of shared vision, perhaps, or simply the pleasure of being taken seriously by an adult who understood the power of imagination. "Lunch is ready," he said finally. They gathered around the small Kit Whitman table, afternoon light streaming through windows that faced east toward the city. Jake served the food he'd prepared with care, watching Victoria take her first bite of salmon and close her eyes in appreciation. "This is incredible," she said. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mom, mostly, and 10 years of trial and error, trying to make sure Sophia ate something other than mac and cheese." "I like mac and cheese," Sophia protested. "You lived on mac and cheese for 3 months when you were 8. "It was a phase." Victoria laughed, and the sound filled the small space with warmth. Jake felt something settle in his chest, the knowledge that this worked, somehow. The three of them around his table, sharing food and stories and easy laughter. "Victoria," Sophia said, cutting her salmon with careful precision, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you dating my dad because you feel sorry for him?" The question hit the table like a small explosion. Jake felt heat flood his face, started to speak, but Victoria held up a gentle hand. "That's a fair question," she said, meeting Sophia's direct gaze. "And the answer is no. I'm dating your dad because he's one of the most genuine people I've ever met, because he makes me laugh, and because he sees me as a person instead of a position. Because when I'm with him, I remember what it feels like to be myself instead of what other people expect me to be." Sophia nodded, considering this answer with 13-year-old seriousness. "Are you going to hurt him?" The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who had watched her father navigate loss and loneliness, who had seen him build walls to protect both of them from further disappointment. Victoria set down her fork, giving Sophia the attention the question deserved. "I hope not. I'm going to try very hard not to. But I can't promise that things won't be complicated or that we'll figure everything out perfectly. Dad says life doesn't come with guarantees. Your dad is right. But I can promise that I care about him, and that I care about you, and that I'm not going anywhere unless he asks me to." Jake watched his daughter process this, saw the moment when her natural protectiveness gave way to cautious acceptance. "Okay," Sophia said finally, "but if you do hurt him, I'll be very disappointed in you." "I would deserve that disappointment." Sophia smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression she'd shown since Victoria arrived. "I like you," she announced. "You're not what I expected, but in a good way." "What did you expect?" "Someone scarier. Someone who would make Dad change into a person we didn't recognize." Sophia glanced at Jake, then back at Victoria. "But you make him more like himself, not less." "That's good." After lunch, they moved to the living room, Sophia curled in the big chair with a book, while Jake and Victoria sat together on the couch, her hand resting on his knee and his arm around her shoulders. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, and somewhere in the building, a neighbor practiced violin, not expertly, but with determination. "This is nice," Victoria murmured against his shoulder. "What is?" "This? Being normal, being part of something ordinary and beautiful." Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the lingering smell of market flowers. "It is beautiful." They sat in comfortable silence, Sophia turning pages, the violin practice continuing its halting melody. Jake thought of all the Saturday afternoons he and Sophia had spent this way, quiet, contained, sufficient unto themselves. This felt like an expansion of that contentment rather than a disruption of it. His phone rang, jarring in the peaceful quiet. Eleanor Whitman's name appeared on the screen. Victoria tensed against him. "I should take this," she said, moving to the Kit Whitman for privacy. Jake heard the murmur of conversation, the shift in Victoria's voice from relaxed to professional. When she returned to the living room, her expression was carefully neutral. "I have to go," she said. There's a situation at the Portland office that needs immediate attention. I'll probably be there through tomorrow." The transformation was swift and complete. Victoria, the woman who'd laughed over tomatoes at the market, disappeared, replaced by Victoria, the CEO, who could handle crises across multiple states. Jake felt the familiar distance opening between them, the reminder that her life contained complications he couldn't begin to understand. "Of course," he said, standing to walk her to the door. At the threshold, Victoria paused, looking back at Sophia, who had lowered her book to watch them. "Thank you for sharing your drawings with me," Victoria said. "And for lunch. This was one of the best afternoons I've had in years." "You can come back any time," Sophia said. "Dad makes pancakes on Sunday mornings." Victoria's smile was soft, genuine. "I'll remember that." She kissed Jake goodbye, a quick press of lips that tasted like the promise of more time together, and then she was gone, leaving him standing in his doorway, watching her disappear down the stairs. "She'll be back," Sophia said from behind him. Jake closed the door and turned to find his daughter watching him with knowing eyes. "How can you be sure?" "Because she looked at you the way you look at her. And because she asked if she could take one of my drawings with her, the one of the library that reads people. She said it would remind her of today." Jake felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "She did?" "Yeah, I think she wants to remember us when she's being important in Portland." Sophia returned to her book, leaving Jake alone with the knowledge that somewhere between the market and lunch and his daughter's careful questions, something had shifted. Victoria wasn't just someone he was dating anymore, she was someone who mattered to Sophia too, someone who had earned a place in the small, careful world they'd built together. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Thank you for today. Tell Sophia her library drawing is going on my office wall. I'll call you tonight." Jake typed back, "We'll be here." The simple words felt like an anchor, a promise of continuity that stretched beyond the complications of their different worlds. As evening fell over Seattle, Jake helped Sophia with homework and thought about the way Victoria had looked, sitting at his Kit Whitman table, not like a visitor, but like someone who belonged. For the first time since Jessica's death, he could imagine a future that included someone else at that table, someone else helping with homework and sharing Saturday morning pancakes. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, pulling Jake from dreams of Victoria's laugh into the harsh fluorescent reality of his Kit Whitman. Eleanor Whitman's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness, clipped and controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something Jake had never heard from her before: fear. "There's been an accident," she said without preamble. "Victoria's car went off Highway 101 coming back from Portland. She's at Harborview Medical Center." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He gripped the phone, his free hand finding the counter for support as his legs threatened to give way. "How bad?" "Conscious, but injured. They're running tests." Eleanor's voice wavered almost imperceptibly. "She's been asking for you." Jake was already moving, pulling on clothes with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Jake." Eleanor's voice stopped him at the door. She was driving back early. She was supposed to stay another day, but she wanted to be home for something called Sunday pancakes. The line went dead. Jake stood in his hallway, keys in hand, the weight of Eleanor's words settling around him like cold water. Victoria had been driving through the night to keep a promise to his 13-year-old daughter, to be part of their small Sunday tradition. He looked toward Sophia's room, where she slept peacefully, unaware that the woman who had become part of their lives was lying in a hospital bed asking for him. The decision was instant. He scribbled a note and left it on her pillow, grabbed his jacket, and ran. Harborview Medical Center at 3 a.m. was a cathedral of controlled urgency. Jake found Eleanor in the waiting area, her usual composure cracked like expensive porcelain. She wore sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look smaller, more human. "Any word?" Jake asked, dropping into the chair beside her. Concussion, definitely. Possible internal injuries. They're doing a CT scan now. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, betraying nerves she usually kept hidden. The car rolled twice. She was wearing her seatbelt, but Jake felt his world tilt sideways. The image of Victoria's car tumbling down an embankment, of her trapped and hurt and alone, made his chest tight with a panic he hadn't felt since Sophia's appendicitis scare. What happened? They think she fell asleep at the wheel. She'd been working 18-hour days on the Portland acquisition, barely sleeping. Eleanor's voice carried self-recrimination. I should have made her stay another night. Should have sent someone else to handle it. Jake studied Eleanor's profile, seeing clearly for the first time the weight she carried as Victoria's protector, the way love could manifest as hypervigilance. She's strong, he said, though the words felt inadequate. She's stubborn, Eleanor corrected, but there was affection beneath the frustration, just like her father. Both of them think they can carry the world alone. They sat in silence punctuated by the hospital's nocturnal symphony, hushed conversations, electronic beeping, the soft squeak of sneakers on linoleum. Jake thought of Victoria as he'd last seen her, disappearing down his apartment stairs with Sophia's drawing tucked under her arm, promising to call that night. She had called, at nearly midnight, her voice warm and sleepy as she told him about her day meetings that ran long, contracts that needed revision, the small victories that kept a business moving forward. They'd talked for an hour about nothing important, the kind of conversation that felt like intimacy made audible. Mr. Rivera? Jake looked up to find a doctor in scrubs approaching, her expression professionally neutral but not unkind. His heart hammered against his ribs. I'm Dr. Patel. Ms. Whitman is awake and stable. The CT scan shows a mild concussion and some bruising, but no internal bleeding. She's asking for you. Relief flooded through Jake so suddenly he felt dizzy. Can I see her? Room 314, but just for a few minutes she needs rest. Jake stood on unsteady legs, Eleanor rising beside him. Go, she said quietly. I'll call her assistant, handle the business side of things. She doesn't need to worry about that right now. The elevator to the third floor felt like the longest ride of Jake's life. When he found room 314, he paused outside the door, gathering courage to see Victoria hurt, to face the reality of how much she had come to mean to him. She looked small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and monitors, her face pale against the white pillow. A bandage covered a cut on her forehead, and her left arm was in a sling, but her eyes were open and alert when he entered. Hey, she said, her voice hoarse but unmistakably hers. Hey, yourself. Jake approached the bed slowly, afraid that moving too quickly might somehow make her more fragile. You scared the hell out of everyone. I'm okay. Victoria tried to sit up straighter and winced. Mostly okay. Jake reached for the chair beside her bed, his legs finally giving way to the relief and residual fear coursing through him. Eleanor said you were coming back early. Victoria's cheeks flushed pink despite her pallor. Pancakes, she said simply. The single word hit Jake harder than any declaration of love could have. Victoria had risked driving through the night, had pushed herself beyond exhaustion for the chance to be part of their Sunday morning tradition. Victoria, I know it sounds stupid, she said quickly, but I kept thinking about sitting at your Kit Whitman table, watching you and Sophia argue about whether chocolate chips belong in pancakes, and I wanted to be there. I wanted to be part of it. Jake felt tears burn his eyes. It's not stupid. I fell asleep at the wheel for pancakes. That's pretty stupid. You fell asleep because you've been working yourself to death. The pancakes were just the reason you finally admitted you wanted something more than work. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her free hand plucking at the hospital blanket. When she spoke, her voice was small, vulnerable in a way that made Jake's chest ache. I've never wanted to be part of something before, a family, I mean. It terrifies me. Jake reached for her uninjured hand, threading their fingers together. Her palm was cold, her grip weak but steady. Why does it terrify you? Because I don't know how to do it without losing myself. My whole life, I've been taught that caring too much makes you weak, that needing people makes you vulnerable. Victoria's eyes found his, dark and honest. But when I'm with you and Sophia, I don't feel weak, I feel more like myself than I've ever been. The words settled between them like a bridge spanning the space between their different worlds. Jake thought of the first night he'd met Victoria, the way she'd looked at him when consciousness returned surprised, as if she couldn't quite believe someone had caught her. "You don't have to lose yourself," he said quietly. "You just have to trust that we want you exactly as you are." Victoria's smile was watery but genuine. "Even when I'm stupid enough to drive all night for breakfast food?" "Especially then." A knock on the door interrupted them. Sophia peeked around the frame, still in her pajamas, her hair mussed from sleep. Jake felt his heart stop. He'd left a note saying there was an emergency, but seeing his daughter here meant she'd convinced someone to bring her, meant she was worried enough to navigate the adult world of hospitals and visiting hours. "Is it okay if I come in?" Sophia asked, her voice smaller than usual. "Of course," Victoria said, struggling to sit up straighter. "Sophia, honey, what are you doing here?" Sophia approached the bed with the careful steps of someone entering sacred space. "Dad's note said you were hurt. I called Mrs. Whitman and asked her to bring me." She looked between Jake and Victoria, her 13-year-old perception taking in details Jake hoped she was too young to understand. "Are you going to be okay?" "I'm going to be fine," Victoria said firmly, "just banged up a little." Sophia nodded, but Jake could see the worry she was trying to hide. "I brought you something." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, smoothing it carefully before handing it to Victoria. Jake recognized it as one of Sophia's drawings, though he couldn't see the details from his angle. Victoria's breath caught. "Sophia, it's a healing garden," Sophia explained, her words coming faster as her nervousness grew. "With plants that grow medicine and places to sit when you're scared. I thought maybe you could hang it in your room while you get better." Victoria's tears came then, silent and steady, as she studied Sophia's drawing with the attention she'd give to the most important business proposal of her life. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me." Sophia beamed, then grew serious again. "You have to promise to be more careful. Dad was really scared, and that scared me." Victoria looked at Jake over Sophia's head, her expression soft with understanding. "I promise. No more late-night drives when I'm tired." "Good." Sophia settled into the chair on the other side of Victoria's bed, as if she planned to stay for a while. "Also, we saved you pancake batter. Dad made it this morning even though you weren't there, in case you got hungry when you got home." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Of course, Sophia had thought to preserve their tradition, to make sure Victoria still had a place at their table even when she couldn't be there. "Thank you," Victoria said, and Jake heard layers of meaning in the simple words, "Both of you. For coming here, for caring about me, for making me feel like I belong somewhere." The three of them sat in the hospital room as morning light began to filter through the windows. Victoria's drawing propped against the water pitcher where she could see it, Sophia chattering about her week at school while Victoria listened with the attention of someone memorizing every word. Jake watched them together, his daughter and the woman he was falling in love with, and felt something settle into place in his chest. This was what family looked like, he realized. Not the perfect nuclear unit he'd once imagined, but something messier and more complicated and infinitely more real. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway an hour later, she found them like that, Sophia, curled in her chair, Victoria's eyes heavy with exhaustion but fixed on his daughter's animated face, Jake holding Victoria's hand while she dozed. "The doctors want to keep her for observation today," Eleanor said quietly. "But she can go home tomorrow, if there are no complications." "I'll stay with her," Jake said without hesitation. Eleanor nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. "I'll take Sophia home, make sure she gets to school." "Actually," Sophia said, looking between the adults with the calculating expression that usually meant she was about to negotiate something. Couldn't I stay home today? To help take care of Victoria? Jake started to object, but Victoria squeezed his hand weakly. Just this once, she said softly. If it's okay with your dad. I'd like the company. Looking at his daughter's hopeful face, at Victoria's grateful expression, Jake felt the last of his resistance crumble. They were becoming a family, the three of them, in ways he'd never planned, but somehow needed more than his next breath. Just this once, he agreed. Eleanor left to handle the discharge paperwork and field the inevitable business calls, leaving Jake and Sophia to keep vigil over Victoria as she slept. They took turns reading to her Sophia from a fantasy novel about dragons and magic, Jake from the newspaper when she requested updates on the outside world. As afternoon faded toward evening, Victoria stirred, her eyes finding Jake's face immediately. Still here, she said, her voice stronger after hours of rest. Still here, he confirmed. Good. Victoria's gaze moved to Sophia, who had fallen asleep in her chair, one of her drawings spread across her lap. She's remarkable, your daughter. She likes you, really likes you, not just tolerates you for my sake. I like her too. More than I knew it was possible to like someone so young. Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. She makes me want to be better, to be someone worth looking up to. Jake felt tears threaten again. You already are. I want to be part of this, Victoria said quietly, her eyes on Sophia's sleeping form. Your life, her life, whatever this is, we're building together. I want to be someone she can count on, someone who shows up for pancakes and school plays and all the ordinary moments that make up a real life. Even if it means less time for work, less focus on being Victoria Whitman, CEO? Victoria's smile was soft but certain, especially then. I spent 20 years building a company. Maybe it's time to spend some time building a family. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and full of possibility. Jake thought of Jessica, of the family they'd started to build before cancer took their future away. He'd never imagined he could have that again, never believed he was allowed to want it. But watching Victoria study his sleeping daughter's face with such tenderness, feeling the weight of her hand in his, Jake realized that love didn't follow timelines or respect the walls people built around their hearts. Sometimes it just arrived in the form of a woman collapsing at a charity gala, and sometimes it grew in the space between catching someone and letting yourself be caught in return. I love you, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Victoria's eyes widened, then filled with tears that caught the last light from the window. I love you too, she whispered. Both of you, my accidental family. Sophia stirred in her chair, blinking awake in the way of children who never fully surrender to sleep in unfamiliar places. Are you two being mushy? She asked, sitting up and stretching. A little bit, Jake admitted. Good, Sophia said matter-of-factly. It's about time. As evening settled over the hospital, the three of them sat together in room 314, no longer strangers brought together by chance, but something new and precious and entirely their own. Victoria would go home tomorrow, Jake would return to work, Sophia would go back to school, and life would resume its normal rhythm. But they would resume it together, as a family built not of obligation or convenience, but of choice. The choice to catch each other when they fell, to show up for pancakes, to love without guarantee, but with complete commitment to the possibility of forever. The healing had begun, Jake realized, not just of Victoria's physical injuries, but of all the broken places in their separate lives. They were learning to be whole together, to trust that the heart could expand without breaking, that love could multiply without diminishing. And in the quiet of the hospital room, with Seattle's lights beginning to twinkle beyond the windows, Jake felt the future stretching out before them like an unwritten story full of Sunday morning pancakes and homework help and all the ordinary miracles that made a life worth living.